I approached this game with enormous expectations. Here's why. 10 years ago, the development studio The Chinese Room was not one I looked at fondly, and I wasn't alone in that. They had most recently released Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs, a game that was set to follow one of the most celebrated and influential horror games ever. And naturally, it did not quite deliver. At least that was my and many others' thoughts at the time, because it was a mechanically stripped down successor to The Dark Descent with a lot of the first game's unique qualities missing altogether. The Chinese Room was also known for Dear Esther, a mod-turned-game that was praised for its emotional storytelling and unique premise, which was also widely criticized by reviewers and a very loud portion of the internet for being, well, not really a game. And if you've ever wondered when the term walking simulator became popular, it was around this time, but back then it wasn't so much a genre title as much as it was a term people threw on things they didn't like or understand, because back then, the widely held belief was, if this game wasn't made for me and the majority of existing gamers, then it must be bad and wrong. What? Niche? No, I don't know what that word means. Now be gone, I've got some karma to farm. Thanks for the gold, kind stranger. And as you can probably imagine, I used to be one of these people then. Well, I grew up, and so did everyone else. We use Twitter for that now. But a peculiar thing happened over the next decade. The term walking simulator began being used in earnest. Popular ones began popping up and the general view of them softened. Then games like Amnesia Rebirth came out and made a lot of us, myself included, wonder, was A Machine for Pigs actually that bad? And no, it wasn't. It was a wonderful game with a stellar narrative and style and soundtrack that was simply weighed down by its gameplay. And its gameplay was only disappointing because of the expectations given by the Amnesia title. Had they attempted to mimic The Dark Descent fully, they likely would have failed. They were a very small studio at the time, who again, were most famous for making a game with very little interactivity. So they played to their strengths, they made a game within their means, and even though it may have taken years for us to appreciate it, they did a stellar job. Which puts them amongst a very small group of developers that were genuinely ahead of their time, and, unfortunately, suffered for it. And without doing anything themselves, they moved from being a company I didn't like to being one that I was genuinely excited for. And that brings us to today, with Still Wakes the Deep, their newest game. And to compound my excitement for the game, they set it in Scotland.
Fucking yash, man.
For those who don't know, I'm from Scotland, born, raised, and still here. I know I don't have the accent, and no, I don't fully know why either. And there was also some rumbling of this being a Lovecraft-inspired horror game too, and that's right up my alley. So yes, this is something I was very excited for. Let's take a look. It's the 1970s and we're on an offshore platform. Sadly, that's where the similarities to Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker end. We take the role of Kaz, an electrician with a troubled home life and a spectacular voice, good lord.
How you doing, boys?
Not bad, Kaz. Raf's here's a bit shaky though. Gonna be the lad's first solo dive this morning.
Alright? You'll be alright, pal. Especially with the big man here looking out for you.
Have you done it before?
Christ, no.
And he's not the only one. Every character in this game has wonderful voice acting, especially considering how rarely authentic Scottish accents pop up in media. It's fucking wild. There are 3 character types you'll hear Scottish accents with normally, and those are British Special Forces soldiers, fantasy dwarves, and, perplexingly, Vikings and other Northern or Central European proxies. Lads, you've got the wrong pagans. And out with these, you don't hear many authentic, non-Shrek-like accents attempted. One that surprised me was Darth Sion from Knights of the Old Republic 2. He sounds great.
It has been here for thousands of years. It is a place where the Sith teachings run strong. It is the threshold of the borders of an ancient empire.
I'm really hoping that the Silent Hill game being developed in Glasgow includes some Scottish voice actors. I'd love that so much.
In my restless dreams I see that town, Mary Hill.
I'll talk more about the Scottish representation here later, but it's also worth noting that we're not the only ones with good accents here. Other neglected accents of the UK pop up too, like at least one spectacular Northern Irish accent, which is a real rarity, as well as some great Northern English accents too. I know this doesn't seem like a big deal, but to me it is. Scottish accents, Northern English accents, Welsh accents, these are so often used simply as world-building spice, for lack of a better term, and that's fine. I love that dwarves usually get our accents. As an elf hater, I'm honoured, but it's nice to hear it in a more organic setting too. And in the opening section of this game, we also get to see how great the attention to detail in the setting and writing actually are. Firstly, the fucking politics. Good God. I don't mean 2024 internet politics. I've made the mistake of referencing that in the past, and my God, I have paid for it. No, I mean the real shit. Talks of workers' unions, socialists, neglectful industry bosses, unsafe working conditions, all stuff that was actually huge in the UK during the 70s. It's all here, and it's approached really well. It's shown that Kaz, the protagonist, quietly has an opinion as well, even if he doesn't directly advocate for anything. He's not openly supportive of unions, instead redirecting questions about it when asked, but in private, he's supportive of them. And when he sees that one of his co-workers is a far-right advocate, he quietly calls him a prick. Regardless of your political stance, it's so refreshing to see a politically inclined character in a relevant setting done with such nuance and realism. It doesn't feel preachy even if the game certainly takes its own stance and makes it quite obvious. In fact, I'd say the majority of the narrative is politically engaged, but I guarantee the pundits won't be making a big deal about it because, well, you know why. But the game is not just walking around and talking to people, because it turns out that some shit goes wrong on this oil rig, and then the flesh goo appears. But most of the game is not you fighting off the flesh goo and eldritch beasts, it's you trying to navigate this piece of shit, unregulated, cheaply built hazard course that is the oil rig. It's genuinely fucked. I think if the unionization and workers' rights had been respected, the flesh goo wouldn't have made nearly as much of an impact, but it also would have made for a substantially less interesting game. Because the fact that you have to deal with not only the threat of an unknown cosmic horror, but also a rapidly deteriorating environment is just wonderful. The urgency and horror couple together so well. It's not dissimilar from games like Dead Space in that regard. But this is where one of my only criticisms of the game comes up. It's not really something I mind too much personally, but it is worth mentioning. The game is incredibly linear, borderline on rails. Now, for a heavy narrative game like this, it works very well, and the pacing exclusively benefits from being so on rails. But I know that's not for everyone. The only universal problems I think this brings in are in the replayability and interface. Replayability because there's virtually none, but that was the same for A Machine for Pigs too. The issue with that arises with the game's price. In the UK, its base price on Steam is $29.99, so I'd imagine around $35 to $40. I beat the game in 5 hours, and I do not feel the need to replay it. While I don't think game length and price necessarily scale in any consistent way, I would say that the price is a bit steep, even if the quality is spectacular. I'd say £20 would be the best price for this. However, I played it on the PC version of Xbox Game Pass, which was a spectacular deal. I know the idea of subscription-based game services is controversial, and I certainly have my own concerns about that, but for something like this, I think it works beautifully, so I'd recommend it there. Another thing that the game does potentially controversially is bring up one of the more insufferable arguments in gaming: the yellow paint argument. However, I think it's perfect here, because like in a lot of modern games, the environments are visually incredibly busy. That's great if you've got a more open world with more relaxed pacing, but in an intentionally paced horror game, you want to be able to recognize where you need to go at any given time. And also, I don't know how universal this is, but all of the boats and ferries I've been on in Scotland have that kind of shit everywhere. I know a lot of industrial places do too. Escape routes and hazards tend to be pretty well highlighted. Sure, the game does go above and beyond that realism with actual yellow paint cans lying around, but still, it feels so much more natural here than it does in games like Resident Evil. But going back to my experience with Scottish boats and ferries, holy shit did they nail the aesthetics here. Most of the boats I've been on were Caledonian McBrain ferries that crossed the Minch from Ullapool to Stornoway. And yes, those are all real words. And they looked identical on the inside to the oil rig in Still Wakes the Deep. It's so distinctly British 60s, 70s. I adore it, even if it makes me feel subconsciously nauseous. Anyway, let's talk about the spooky stuff. The game's approach to Lovecraftian horror is very much in line with the current meta, for lack of a better term. Rather than being tentacly and purple like you'd find in older stuff, it's fleshy, red body horror, with some purples and greens as a little nod to the old fans. The main antagonistic force is very similar to the Shadow from Amnesia: The Dark Descent, something which was ironically not in A Machine for Pigs. Pulsating flesh masses which can hurt you and confuse you and rip apart the environment, and are generally a bit inconvenient. Visually, I think the game takes a lot of inspiration from The Thing and Annihilation, which are two of the best things you can take body horror inspiration from. Truly, some of the sights here are fucking grim, and it's great. But for the roaming enemies which do exist, they take a lot of beats. from Soma, which is another spectacular thing to take from. They're remnants of humans, mostly your friends and co-workers that have been consumed by this otherworldly force. They moan and weep and cry out for help, all while stabbing at you with weird fleshy tendrils. They're harrowing to see and hear, especially when you can make out the details of the person they once were. Some of my favorite moments in the game were when you find people who are mid-transition from human to whatever they will become. It's not just played for shock or horror either, these were Kaz's friends. It's tragic, and the emotional beats in the game overall are very hard-hitting. I've criticized other Lovecraft-inspired media in the past for being too human-centric or emotional, but overall, I don't actually get much of a Lovecraft intent from this game. Outside of the main antagonist, of course, but more than anything else, this is Kaz's story. This is about him navigating a horrific tragedy. The aesthetics of what have caused the tragedy are secondary to his reaction to it. It's similar to how A Machine for Pigs deviated from the Dark Descent's cosmic horror and instead focused on Oswald Mandis and his personal journey while having that cosmic horror linger in the background. It's what the Chinese Room does best, and they absolutely killed it here. In a good way. The enemy encounters themselves are pretty cool, but some were quite unforgiving. The main defense you have against the roaming enemies is sound, and the game gives you a ton of things to chuck about in order to distract foes. I did encounter one annoying issue where, in the generator section of the game, there were these invisible walls that my distractions bounced off, meaning I had to just sit there and wait for this lad to leave. But other than that, the encounters worked really well and were genuinely stressful. If that worries you though, and you're not into that kind of horror, you can disable them altogether. This game has a story mode option which reduces the horror elements similar to Soma's safe mode. They really just want you to experience Kaz's story however you see fit. And good lord, they really went out of their way for that. The accessibility options are spectacular too. They went above and beyond with things like customizable QuickTime event timers, high contrast filters, flashing light toggles, as well as your standard colorblind and motion sickness stuff. Even without the enemy chases and whatnot, there is still plenty of unsettling imagery. There's one section near the start where somebody is trapped with something else inside of a diving bell, and it thrashes from side to side as the person screams and moans. It's just a very uneasy thing to witness, even if we can't see what's actually going on. You may have noticed from the footage that there's this weird Black Ops style image distortion sometimes, and that's this game's version of a sanity effect or filter. And I really like it for several reasons. First of all, it actually has a practical use as it reactively moves around to show you where the threat or scare is coming from. Secondly, it's really good at emulating tunnel vision. Nothing I've played really nails tunnel vision, which is something I personally get a lot when stressed, but this has a really cool way of visualizing it. And I mean, it does also have the added bonus of making me think about playing Call of Duty Black Ops Zombies after school in the winter of 2011 at a friend's house, which I think is a universal experience. But really, after I finished the game, it wasn't the horror or aesthetics that stuck with me. It was the characters and their interactions. One of my favorite moments in the game is between Kaz and his friend Roy. There's no horror, no interactivity, just a conversation between friends who are in a pretty nasty scenario.
Kaz, mate, I'm not going to make it over the deck. I'm not feeling so good, pal. I think I need my insulin.
What? You're fucking kidding, Roy. Now?
Oh, I'm sorry to inconvenience you, Mr. Bloody Fit and Healthy. I tell you what, I'll have a little chat with my pancreas, shall I, and tell it to pull its socks up.
All right, fuck's sake. Could you not just eat some fucking jam or something?
Oh, bloody hell, the man's a medical genius. I'll get on the blower to Dr. fucking Spock and tell him not to panic. We've solved diabetes here.
It's fucking McCoy. No Spock. He was the point-eared cunt.
And what I love about this is that it's light-hearted while not taking you out of it. It's not a quip or some out-of-place joke conversation. It's a real attempt at levity that people would make in such a frightening time. Also, another great part of this is that they say the word cunt a lot. Now, I know that's a very bad word across the pond, but in every other English-speaking country and basically everywhere in Europe, we say a lot. I don't appreciate Americans taking it from us and turning it into a misogynistic slur. Anyone can be a it's not even necessarily a derogatory term. I think the wider problem is that Americans, I love you, but you're not very good at swearing. You guys are very good at a lot of things, but you've not nailed down swearing yet, because you insist on giving everything a meaning and you don't put your heart into it. Hey asshole, you're a twat. It just doesn't sound right.
Yo, dickhead, you're a twat.
Doesn't that just sound better? But yeah, the point is, the game doesn't pull its punches with the swearing because that's how people are here. Not everyone, but a lot of us. I know it's a bit silly for me to be so happy about accurate Scottish representation here because we're not the most underrepresented people. We're a relatively well-off Northern European English-speaking country. We're doing alright. But for me, it's really nice to see. Like I said earlier, we're often used as a trope, and a lot of the time, a punchline too, which is fine, we can take it. But we are a fucking spectacular bunch. We have less people than the state of Minnesota, but we brought the world the telephone, the television, refrigeration, antibiotics, color photography, mammal cloning, the fucking Industrial Revolution, golf, cycling, Grand Theft Auto, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Emperor Palpatine, David Tennant, Brian Limond, David Byrne, Annie Lennox, and I could go on. We've been a busy bunch, so it's nice to see us taken a bit more seriously every so often. But I do understand we're also kind of an inherently funny people, and we do wear that badge with honor. Do go and play Still Wakes the Deep. It was a genuine pleasure to experience, and I hope you guys like it as much as I did. And a special shout out to the person who wrote this in the game's credits.
Benny Harvey, R.I.P. Miss you, big man. Gone but not forgotten.